The air in the great hall tasted of pine, winter chill, and sudden, suffocating dread. When the Alpha uttered the ancient words of rejection, he expected weeping. Instead, she simply nodded. The ensuing silence was deafening, broken only by the monstrous, bone-rattling snarl of the Alpha King losing his mind. The winter solstice celebration at the fortress of Blackwood was a spectacle of medieval opulence, designed to mask the brutal, political realities of the werewolf domains. Torches of pine pitch blazed along the stone walls, casting long, dancing shadows over the assembled nobility. Roast boar and spiced wine scented the air, but beneath the aromas of the feast lay the sharp, metallic tang of ambition and predatory instinct. Genevieve Sterling stood near the heavy oak doors, blending into the tapestry of servants and lower-ranking pack members. She was a Sterling, a surname that once commanded respect when her father, Beta Thomas Sterling, commanded the vanguard. But Thomas had died defending the northern borders from rogue incursions 3 winters ago, leaving Genevieve orphaned and entirely unprotected in a society that valued only power and lineage. Now, she was little more than a scullery maid in the eyes of Alpha Kalen, the newly ascended leader of the Blackwood Pack. Kalen was the epitome of a young, arrogant ruler. Tonight was supposed to be his triumph. He had spent months negotiating a lucrative mating alliance with Lady Catherine of the House of Beaumont, a wealthy fiefdom that controlled the lucrative eastern silver mines. The alliance would make Kalen one of the most powerful alphas in the realm. The entire court knew he intended to announce Catherine as his chosen Luna before the night was over. Even the Alpha King, Valerius of the Blood Moon Court, had graced the hall with his terrifying presence to witness the treaty. Valerius sat on the raised dais, a monolithic figure of dark leather, steel, and silent lethality. He was a tyrant wrapped in regal velvet, a ruler who had reigned without a mate for over a century. His eyes, a chilling, piercing silver, surveyed the hall with absolute, crushing boredom. As the fortress bell tolled midnight, the heavy scent of the moon goddess's blessing descended upon the hall. This was the hour of the mating pull. Genevieve felt at first a sudden, violent tug behind her ribs, as if a hook had been set into her very soul. The scent hit her like a physical blow. Crushed mint, rain-soaked earth, and sharp cedar. She gasped, dropping the silver tray of chalices she had been carrying. The clatter echoed loudly in the sudden quiet of the hall. Across the room, Alpha Kalen stopped mid-sentence. He was standing beside Lady Catherine and her father, Lord Henry Beaumont. Kalen's head snapped toward the back of the hall. His nostrils flared. The golden thread of the mate bond, invisible to all but the two of them, snapped taut across the crowded room, connecting the powerful Alpha directly to the orphaned daughter of a dead Beta. Genevieve's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Mates. The moon goddess had paired her with the Alpha. For a split second, a foolish, desperate hope flared in her chest, but as Kalen's gaze locked onto hers, there was no warmth. There was only raw, unadulterated revulsion. The silence in the great hall grew suffocating as Kalen strode across the stone floor. The crowd parted for him, murmurs rippling through the nobility. He stopped inches from Genevieve, towering over her. The mate bond screamed at them to touch, to claim. But Kalen's jaw was set in stone. He looked at her worn linen dress, her calloused hands, and then up at the high table, where Lord Beaumont was watching with eyes narrowed in political calculation. You, Kalen hissed, his voice dropping to a vicious whisper, meant only for her. A peasant. A beggar in my halls. You think I would tie the Blackwood legacy to a bloodline that died in the mud? Genevieve's breath hitched. Kalen, the goddess is a fool, he snarled loudly, stepping back so the entire hall could hear. He wanted this public. He needed to prove to the Beaumonts that a mere trick of fate would not derail his ambitions. Kalen raised his voice, letting his alpha command bleed into his words, forcing the lesser wolves in the room to lower their heads. I am Kalen of the Blackwood Pack. I am the Lord of the Northern Pines, and I do not accept a beggar as my equal. A collective gasp echoed off the stone-vaulted ceilings. Rejecting a true mate was a taboo so severe it was rarely spoken of, let alone performed in front of the Alpha King. It was said to tear a wolf's soul in half. Kalen's eyes glowed a sickly, unnatural yellow. I, Alpha Kalen, formally and permanently reject you, Genevieve Sterling. as my mate, my Luna, and my equal. The words struck Genevieve like a physical blow. The invisible golden thread connecting them turned black, burning with an agonizing heat. It was a pain designed to break a she-wolf, to force her to her knees in weeping submission, begging for a mercy that would not come. The crowd waited for her to scream, to shatter, to crawl at his boots. Genevieve felt the blood drain from her face. Her inner wolf howled in excruciating agony, clawing at the confines of her mind. The rejection was poison in her veins, but as she looked at Kaelin's smug, triumphant face and the sneering visage of Lady Catherine behind him, the agony gave way to something colder. Something forged by the harsh winters she had survived alone. She was a Sterling. Her father had died on his feet, and she would not die on her knees. Genevieve straightened her spine. She locked her trembling knees, raised her chin, and met Kaelin's eyes with a chilling, dead-eyed calm. Her voice, when she spoke, did not shake. It rang out through the breathless hall, clear as a silver bell. I, Genevieve Sterling, accept your rejection, Alpha Kaelin. May your bloodline reap exactly what you have sown. Snap. The psychic backlash of the finalized severing ripped through the room. Genevieve staggered back half a step, a single drop of blood trailing from her left nostril. But she did not fall. She stood tall, her gaze unbroken. Kaelin blinked, visibly thrown. He had expected hysterics. He had expected to look powerful. Instead, her quiet, dignified acceptance made him look like a petulant, cruel child. The great hall went completely, terrifyingly silent. Not a single wolf dared to breathe. They stared in shock at the orphaned girl who had just taken an alpha's rejection straight to the chest without shedding a single tear. It was a profound, awe-inspiring silence. And then, from the high dais at the front of the hall, came the sound of thick glass shattering. All eyes whipped toward the high table. King Valerius had crushed his heavy, crystal goblet in his bare hand. Dark red wine, mixed with the king's own blood, dripped from his clenched fist, pooling onto the white linen tablecloth like a fatal wound. For 100 years, King Valerius had been known as the Statue of Blood Moon. He was a sovereign who ruled through cold logic and ruthless, unfeeling precision. He had never shown anger, never shown joy, and had completely abandoned the idea of a mate. His inner beast was an ancient, scarred thing, locked away in a fortress of iron will. But when Genevieve Sterling severed her bond with Kaelin, when she released her spirit from the Blackwood Alpha's claim, a vacuum was created in the magical ether of the hall, and in that instantaneous void, the true scent of her soul was suddenly laid bare, unmasked and unprotected. It hit Valerius like a battering ram. Vanilla, old parchment, and the crisp scent of winter snow. It wasn't just a scent. It was a lifeline. It was the missing half of a soul that had been bleeding out in the dark for a century. Valerius's dormant beast didn't just wake up. It exploded into his consciousness with the force of a detonating star. Mate. The single, possessive thought echoed so violently in Valerius's mind that it fractured his legendary control. He felt the agonizing echo of the pain Genevieve had just endured. His mate, his queen, his reason for breathing had just been humiliated, discarded, and hurt by an arrogant, insignificant whelp of an alpha. The air in the great hall underwent a terrifying shift. The ambient temperature plummeted by 20 degrees in a matter of seconds. Frost instantly crystallized on the edges of the silver platters and the stone pillars. The torches lining the walls flickered wildly, turning from a warm orange to a ghostly, supernatural blue. "Your Majesty?" Lord Henry Beaumont stammered, shrinking away from the king as an oppressive, suffocating weight began to press down on the room. It was the king's alpha aura. It was not a request for submission. It was a physical manifestation of a monarch's murderous wrath. Crack. The solid obsidian stone of the high dais splintered under Valerius's boots as he stood. He didn't bother using the stairs. He stepped straight off the 5-foot drop, landing on the hall floor with a heavy, ominous thud that vibrated through the boots of every wolf present. Valerius raised his head. His eyes were no longer silver. They were completely, terrifyingly black, save for a ring of bleeding crimson around the iris. His beast was entirely at the surface. "Kneel," Valerius commanded. He didn't yell. The word was spoken in a low, vibrating growl that bypassed the ears and sank directly into the marrow of their bones. Instantly, the entire hall collapsed. Hundreds of wolves, from noble lords to seasoned warriors, slammed to their knees against the cold stone floor, entirely stripped of their free will by the sheer, godly magnitude of the king's command. Lady Catherine whimpered, her face pressed to the dirt. Even Alpha Kalen, the proud, arrogant fool, found his legs buckling. He fought it, his face turning purple with exertion. But the king's aura was an anvil dropping on his shoulders. With a choked gasp, Kalen crashed to his knees, his hands braced on the floor, trembling violently as his inner wolf whimpered in absolute terror. Only one person remained standing, Genevieve. The oppressive, crushing weight of the king's aura flowed around her like a river parting around a sacred stone. She stood alone in a sea of kneeling wolves, breathing heavily, still clutching the folds of her worn dress, staring in wide-eyed shock as the most dangerous predator in the realm walked slowly toward her. Valerius's movements were fluid, predatory, and completely fixated. He didn't even look at Kalen as he stepped past the kneeling Alpha. He walked until he was mere inches from Genevieve. Up close, he was a mountain of muscle and dark leather, smelling of wood smoke, old magic, and raw power. Genevieve's heart stuttered. The pain of the rejection was suddenly being overridden by a new, terrifyingly intense heat blooming in her chest. She looked up into the king's crimson-ringed eyes, expecting violence, expecting execution for causing a scene. Instead, Valerius's terrifying expression completely fractured. The king lifted a massive, blood-stained hand. His fingers, trembling ever so slightly, reached out. He didn't grab her. He didn't force her. With agonizing gentleness, he brushed the pad of his thumb against her cheek, wiping away the single drop of blood that had fallen from her nose. The moment his skin touched hers, a golden light, blinding and pure, flashed through the hall. A mate bond so ancient and powerful that it made the torches flare blindingly white. Valerius let out a ragged, shuddering breath, the sound of a drowning man breaking the surface of the water. He leaned down, burying his face into the crook of Genevieve's neck, inhaling her scent as if it were oxygen. Mine. The Alpha King rumbled against her skin, the word echoing with absolute, terrifying finality through the silent hall. My queen. On the floor beside them, Kalen's eyes widened in horror as the realization of his catastrophic mistake finally dawned on him. He hadn't just rejected a peasant, he had just rejected the king's true mate, and the king's retribution was going to be biblical. The oppressive silence of the great hall was shattered only by the terrified, rattling breaths of the kneeling nobility. Alpha Kalen, once the proud and sneering lord of the Blackwood Pack, was completely plastered to the stone floor, his cheek pressing into the freezing dirt. The Alpha King's aura was a physical manifestation of gravity, and it was crushing the breath from Kalen's lungs. King Valerius did not spare the disgraced Alpha a single glance. His entirely blackened eyes, ringed in violent crimson, were fixed solely on Genevieve. He kept his massive hand gently cupped against her jaw, his thumb softly tracing the line of her cheekbone. The contrast between the monstrous, world-ending power he was projecting to the room and the agonizingly tender way he touched her was staggering. You are trembling, little wolf, Valerius murmured, his voice a deep, resonant cello that vibrated directly into her chest. It has been a rather overwhelming evening, Your Majesty, Genevieve replied. Her voice wavered, but she forced herself to meet his terrifying gaze. She was a sterling. She would not cower, not even before the king. A low, rumbling sound that might have been a chuckle vibrated in Valerius's chest. The dark, feral edge in his eyes softened just a fraction as he recognized the sheer, unadulterated iron in her spine. You did not weep when the fool severed the bond. You stood. My father taught me that tears are a waste of water when surrounded by enemies, she said quietly. Valerius's gaze darkened, the crimson rings flaring brightly. You are surrounded by enemies no longer. The goddess has demanded a balancing of the scales, and I, he whispered, pressing his forehead lightly against hers, am the scale. Slowly, Valerius turned away from Genevieve. The tender, protective mate vanished in a millisecond, replaced by the ancient, ruthless tyrant of the Blood Moon Court. The temperature in the hall plummeted another 10 degrees. The frost on the stone pillars thickened into solid ice. Valerius looked down at Kalen. Stand. The crushing magical weight lifted just enough for Kalen to gasp for air. Trembling violently, the young alpha pushed himself up to his knees, but he could not bring himself to rise to his feet. He kept his head bowed, his hands shaking against his thighs. Lady Catherine, kneeling a few feet away, was quietly sobbing into her silk skirts, her political ambitions entirely pulverized in the span of 3 minutes. "Your Majesty," Kalen choked out, his voice raw and reedy. I did not know." The scent was masked by the servitude, by the dirt. "Do you take me for a fool, boy?" Valerius's voice cracked through the hall like a silver whip. A true alpha knows his mate if she is bathed in mud and ash. You knew. You felt the pull of the goddess. You simply chose your own vanity and a pathetic silver alliance over the sacred laws of our kind. Lord Henry Beaumont, kneeling by the high table, dared to raise his head. "Sire, please. This is a misunderstanding." The alliance between Blackwood and Beaumont was forged in good faith, backed by the Rothschild silver reserves, documented in the Astor archives. "Silence!" Valerius roared. The sheer sonic force of the command shattered the remaining crystal goblets on the high table. Lord Henry clamped his hands over his ears, dropping back to the floor. Valerius sneered, his lip curling to reveal elongated, razor-sharp canines. "You speak to me of the Rothschild reserves and the Astor archives as if I do not possess the true ledgers of this world. You think your little provincial conspiracies escape the Blood Moon Court? I know exactly what funds the Beaumont silver mines." The king stepped closer to Lord Henry, his boots echoing like a death knell. "The Medici smuggling lines. You have been funneling silver to the Hessian rogue factions in the southern valleys, breeding an insurgency. You sought the Blackwood vanguard to protect your treasonous supply chains. You are a traitor to the crown, Henry." A collective gasp swept through the remaining pack members. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place. Kalen's lucrative marriage alliance wasn't just a grab for wealth. It was a blind, arrogant step into a treasonous war. Kalen looked up, his eyes wide with horror as he stared at Lord Henry. Is this true? You told me the silver was bound for the royal mints. You are a terrible alpha, Kalen," Valerius stated coldly, stepping back toward the center of the room. "Blind to treason, deaf to the goddess, and cruel to the very bloodlines that built your fortress. Thomas Sterling died holding the northern pass so your father could sleep securely in his bed, and you repay his sacrifice by forcing his daughter to scrub your floors and publicly humiliating her." Valerius raised his right hand. A dark, crackling energy, resembling black lightning, began to arc between his fingers. It was the ancient magic of the first wolves, a power granted only to the sovereign bloodline. "Genevieve Sterling accepted your rejection," Valerius proclaimed, his voice echoing with absolute, divine authority. "The bond is severed, but I do not accept your reign. I invoke the right of the broken crown," Kalen screamed. It was a sound of absolute, soul-tearing terror. "No, sire, please, I beg you." Mercy, Valerius whispered, "is a luxury for the innocent." The king slammed his hand downward. The black lightning arced from his fingertips, striking Kalen squarely in the chest. The young alpha convulsed violently. A sickening, ethereal tearing sound echoed through the great hall as Kalen's alpha sparked the magical essence that commanded the pack and granted him his supernatural strength was forcibly ripped from his soul. Kalen collapsed, writhing on the floor as his eyes shifted from the glowing gold of an alpha to the dull, muddy brown of an omega. He had not been killed, but he had been utterly destroyed. He was stripped of his rank, his power, and his dignity. Valerius turned his terrible gaze to Lord Henry Beaumont. "The Beaumont lands are forfeit to the Blood Moon Court. The Blackwood pack is hereby dissolved and absorbed into my own vanguard. The Royal Guard will escort you and your daughter to the dungeon, Henry, where you will face the executioner at dawn for treason." The king turned his back on the weeping remnants of the nobility. He walked back to Genevieve, the dark lightning fading from his hands. As he approached her, the crushing weight of his aura vanished completely, leaving the air light and warm. He held out his hand to her. It was heavily scarred, the hand of a warrior who had lived 100 lifetimes, yet it was completely steady. "Come, my queen." Valerius said softly. "This rotting fortress is no longer your home." Genevieve looked at the hand offered to her, then at the groveling form of Kaelin on the floor. A sense of profound, startling peace washed over her. She reached out, placing her small, calloused hand into the king's. Valerius's fingers closed gently around hers, and he pulled her close to his side. Together, they walked out of the great hall, leaving the ruins of the Blackwood Pack in their wake. The journey to the Blood Moon Court took 3 weeks, traversing the treacherous, snow-choked passes of the Atlas Mountains. For Genevieve, it was a profound transition from the life of a discarded servant to the most powerful woman in the werewolf realm. Valerius's court was a sprawling, Gothic masterpiece carved directly into the side of a massive, dormant volcano. It was a city of obsidian and silver, ancient and unyielding, but as intimidating as the fortress was, it was the king himself who occupied Genevieve's every thought. Valerius was not the monster the rumors claimed. Behind closed doors, away from the prying eyes of his generals, the terrifying Alpha King was fiercely, obsessively devoted. He spent hours simply sitting with her by the hearth fire, listening to her speak of her father, of the history she had read in secret, of her dreams. He showered her in silks and jewels. But what she valued most was the way he looked at her, not as a prize, but as an equal. "You have the mind of a tactician, Genevieve," Valerius told her one evening, poring over maps of the southern borders in his study. "Your father taught you well. He taught me how to read the terrain." "Valerius," she replied, tracing a line along a valley pass. "But it was surviving Kaelin's court that taught me how to read people." Her ascension to queen was met with awe by the general populace, who revered the moon goddess's decree. But the political elite of the Blood Moon Court were inherently suspicious. They saw a young, inexperienced girl. They did not see the iron beneath the velvet. It took exactly 2 months for that iron to be tested. The execution of Lord Henry Beaumont had severed the head of the Southern conspiracy, but the body still twitched. A massive faction of rogue wolves, funded by the hidden remnants of the Medici silver lines, launched a desperate, coordinated attack on the eastern gates of the Blood Moon Fortress. The timing was a calculated betrayal. Valerius and his primary vanguard were 3 days north, quelling a border dispute in the highlands. Genevieve was left in the obsidian fortress with only the secondary garrison. The war horns blew at midnight, a terrifying, dissonant wail that shattered the quiet of the city. Genevieve stood on the high balconies of the royal spire, watching as thousands of torches breached the lower valley. The rogues were disorganized, but they possessed overwhelming numbers. The secondary garrison, led by Commander Thorne, was preparing to lock down the inner keep and wait out the siege. "My queen, we must move you to the secure vaults," Commander Thorne urged, his armor clanking as he bowed hastily. "The outer walls will fall within the hour." Genevieve stared down at the approaching army. She recognized the banners. They were carrying the sigil of the disgraced Blackwood Pack, merged with the rogue Hessian marks. Kaelin, the stripped Omega, had survived, rallied the dregs of the mercenaries, and was seeking his revenge while the king was away. "No," Genevieve said, her voice dropping into a cold, commanding register that sounded startlingly like Valerius. "If we retreat to the keep, they will slaughter the civilians in the lower city. My father did not cower behind walls while his people bled, and neither will I." She turned to Thorne, her eyes flashing with the golden light of the Luna spark she had inherited upon mating the king. "Commander, the rogues are attacking the eastern gates, but they are mercenaries. They fight for Semite, not loyalty. They expect us to defend the choke point. We will not." Thorne blinked. "Your Majesty, open the eastern gates," Genevieve ordered. "Let them flood into the main courtyard. But station our archers on the aqueduct ridges and pack the courtyard with the sulfur stores from the deep mines." It was a brilliant, highly dangerous trap. Genevieve donned a chestplate of lightweight, ceremonial silver armor and descended to the battlements herself. When Kaelin led the charge through the seemingly abandoned eastern gates, he thought he had won. The rogues poured into the courtyard, howling for blood. Kaelin, shifting into his mangy, brown Omega form, looked up at the battlements, searching for the queen he intended to drag down. He saw her standing alone on the upper ridge, a lone figure in silver. "Now," Genevieve commanded. Flaming arrows rained down from the hidden aqueduct ridges, striking the sulfur stores packed into the courtyard wagons. The explosion was catastrophic. A wall of green fire erupted in the enclosed space, instantly incinerating the front lines of the rogue army and trapping the rest in a chaotic, burning cage. Panic seized the mercenaries. The surviving forces, realizing they had walked into a slaughterhouse, broke ranks and fled back through the gates. The secondary garrison easily swept through, cutting down the stragglers. Kaelin was caught beneath a collapsed, burning wagon. Genevieve walked down the stone steps into the smoldering courtyard. She stood over the ruined, broken man who had once discarded her like trash. "You thought me weak because I did not scream when you broke my heart, Kaelin," Genevieve said quietly, staring down at him as the guards moved in to arrest him. "You never understood. The silence wasn't submission. It was preparation." When Valerius returned 2 days later, he rode his massive black warhorse through the scorched eastern gates, his face pale with a terror he had not felt in a century. He threw himself from the saddle, ignoring his generals, and sprinted up the steps of the keep. He found Genevieve in the throne room, casually reviewing damage reports with Commander Thorne. Valerius crossed the room in 3 massive strides, pulling her out of her chair and crushing her against his chest. He buried his face in her hair, his massive frame shaking. "I felt the panic in our bond. I thought I had lost you." Genevieve wrapped her arms tightly around his armored waist, resting her head against his chest. "You will never lose me, Valerius. I told you I would protect our home." The king pulled back, framing her face in his hands. He looked at the soot on her cheek, the exhaustion in her eyes, and the absolute, unshakable strength radiating from her soul. The court had called her the Scullery Queen. Behind her back, but as Valerius looked at her, and as the generals of the Blood Moon Court knelt in genuine, awestruck reverence before her, he knew she had forged her own legend. "You are no fragile thing to be kept in a tower," Valerius whispered fiercely, pressing his lips to her forehead. "You are the Winter Queen, and the realm will tremble before you." Genevieve's reign alongside King Valerius became a golden era documented in the high archives of werewolf history. She was a ruler who blended tactical brilliance with a profound, unyielding empathy for the lower castes. The scullery maid who had silently accepted an alpha's cruelest rejection did not just survive. She rose to command the very empire that once overlooked her, proving that true power isn't granted by bloodlines, but forged in the quiet fires of endurance.